In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the ZBrush interface as a whole. So far in the Quick Start tutorial, we've looked at how to use the most important fundamental aspects of the interface, those menus that you're going to constantly be going back to. I like to introduce ZBrush using that technique and then step back and look at the interface as a whole, because oftentimes, especially with new users, this can be a really intimidating view. You're looking at all these different buttons and you're not quite sure what goes where and how to use it. Well, my hope is that in this lecture we can demystify this and see how all these parts fit together, and also illustrate how so many of these things are nowhere near as complicated as they might look at first glance. So let's just go ahead and get started. When you first open ZBrush, it'll look something like this. You'll have a Quick Start or a Lightbox menu here, which is essentially a file browser. The Lightbox allows you to bring in any sort of file that you could save out of ZBrush. I'll close that just by clicking the Lightbox button. You'll see that I have a Z tool currently loaded. It's in my tool palette here. These big square buttons are palettes. If I were to click on the tool palette, you can see there's several different Z tools available. This is the one that has been loaded. If I click and drag, it will draw it on the canvas, and then I will immediately click Edit or press the T hotkey to go into edit mode. Now, if I want to center my object on screen, I will press the F key. That is F as in frame. It's the same as pressing this frame button down here. Right there. Now, we've already looked at navigation. Let's take a look at what all these buttons and all these sliders and menus mean. On the left-hand side, we've got this bar. The majority of these are palettes. You've got the brush palette, the stroke palette, the alpha palette, texture, material, and color palette. These palettes are just like any other artist palette. It's essentially a panel which contains several different options from which you can choose to then apply to your model. So the color palette is self-explanatory. That's what we're accustomed to seeing, an artist palette with color on it. However, we also have a palette full of brushes. We have a palette of different strokes. The strokes affect how your brush is applied to the surface. Is it a straight line? Is it a freehand stroke? Is it a spattering spray? The alpha palette allows you to select different alphas, which are images that have been brought into ZBrush, which are grayscale, and then used to change the shape of your brush tip. Now, we can also use alphas for other things inside of ZBrush, and we'll talk about those, but the most important use of them is to change the shape of your brush. Now, we've also got the texture palette. The texture palette allows us to load different textures into ZBrush, which are then used as you would use textures in any other program. It also allows us to export textures out as well. The material palette allows us to change our material. So by default, we usually see the red wax shader in ZBrush. And if we wanted to change that, we could just click the material palette and then select from any other material here that we want. In this case, I prefer the basic material too. Now, on the right side bar, we've got these much smaller icons. The top one is the BPR menu. That's the best preview render. That's your main renderer in ZBrush. It's also the button that you'll use to invoke the renderer link with KeyShot. So if you want to do your rendering outside of ZBrush, you can use this button. These buttons here, scroll, zoom, actual, and AA half, these actually are moving the document window itself. Now, in ZBrush, your document window is your workspace. This is the document window. Now, ZBrush started out as a 2.5D illustration tool, so as a result of that, it retains some of its ability to create images on your canvas. So as you're working, you may often find that you might accidentally get something like that, where you get a copy of your model on the canvas. It's something that I see happen often. What's happened there is you've just accidentally hit a hotkey, which is Shift-S, and that's a snapshot tool. Snapshot allows you to basically store an image of your model on the canvas that you can then share as a JPEG or a PSD file with an art director or other artists. This is using the document window as an image plane. If I have images stuck on the image plane here and I want to get rid of it, I just press Ctrl-N and it will clear the canvas. Now, because the workspace here is also an image plane, we will use scroll, zoom, actual, and AA half to impact the size of that image plane. Now, that's typically not used anymore. It was used quite a bit early on in ZBrush's growth stages when it was being used a lot to do 2.5D illustration. We will use these a lot now, but you're never going to zoom into your document to make your object bigger. Generally, I just keep it at actual size, and then I will zoom the actual model. So this is zooming the model, whereas this is zooming the document. So it's just an important distinction to understand. Here we've got the perspective mode that just turns on and off your perspective. The floor plane is here. That just turns on a floor plane in ZBrush. Here this model is actually sitting underneath the floor. Local transformation just allows us to rotate around the local center of the object. And local symmetry allows us to have X symmetry on objects that have been moved away from the origin. So if we're working on an object that has been moved away from 0, 0, 0 and it's sitting over here, you can turn on local symmetry and still get X symmetry on that object. These are your rotational settings. I leave it always at X, Y, Z. You can constrain it to just Y or Z, but I've never found a time that was actually necessary. The frame button we've already looked at. That's the same as the frame, the F hotkey. Move, scale, and rotate are for moving and scaling and rotating your model. We looked at those in the Quick Start lecture. I recommend that you don't use these buttons. Just learn your keyboard and mouse navigations. It'll make you a lot faster and more confident in the program. Polyframe is the same as the Shift F button. That just frames the object, gives you the polygon frame view. Transparency allows you to see through your subtools to other objects. Solo will hide everything except for the currently selected subtool. Now this is actually interesting. There's a little button hidden inside the button called Dynamic. If I turn that on and then rotate, that's Dynamic Solo, so it will only solo as I'm rotating, which can be useful especially when you're working on a really complicated model, maybe with lots of armor or mechanical parts. I'll click Dynamic again to turn that off. Then Expose will actually explode out all your subtools so you can see them spread out on screen. That's actually quite a useful tool when you're working on a very complicated model as well. Now this brings us to the sidebar here. I call this the side dock. There's actually two of these. There's one on the left and the right-hand side of the screen. Typically the left-hand side is hidden. The right-hand side is the default. You can open and close it by clicking these little arrows here. Here we've got the tool menu loaded into the dock, but if I were to click this little radial button, it'll close it and it's now empty. This allows you to dock menus from the top of the screen onto your sidebar. So if I go to the tool menu here, there's a little radial button. If I click that, it'll tear it off and then dock it on the side of the screen. I can do several different menus here and stack them all up. And now if I want to scroll between them, just click in this gray area and drag. If you want to close them out, just click the radial icon again and it will close it and send it away. Now, something I want to point out is everything that you see on screen right now, all of these buttons and all of these sliders, these are all cloned out of these top menus here. These top menus are the core of ZBrush. This is where all of your options live. All of these buttons and all of these sliders, these are just clones of things that actually live in these menus up here. So these are just pulled out to simplify the process so you can find the things that you use the most often and then access these menus for things that might be a little more specialized. Also, if there's ever a point you're not sure what an interface item does, mouse over it. The first thing you'll see is the name of the item and its hotkey. So that's the Move button, and the hotkey is W. Then if you press the Control key, it'll open up a manual page for that particular object. So you can very easily see what all of these things do. Just about everything in ZBrush has an associated Control manual page with it. So it's extremely useful if you're learning the program and unsure of what something does. Now along the top bar, we've got a selection of different buttons. The first three here, Projection Master, Lightbox, and Quick Sketch. Projection Master is a script for texturing. It's something that's used in the back end of ZAppLink, which we'll talk about in the texturing section. Lightbox we've already seen, that's simply a file browser. And then Quick Sketch is a sketching tool. It's a Z plugin that was written to allow you to sketch inside of ZBrush. It's not something that I use very often, but it's important to know that it is there. Next, you see we've got the Edit button, and the Edit button we have already used. Edit just puts the object into edit mode so you can actually manipulate it. Draw is the draw pointer. That is the difference between being in draw mode or being in transpose. If we're in draw mode with edit on, we're sculpting. If we go to move, scale, or rotate, we're now in transpose mode. You can see that it says transpose here. The transpose tools we've already seen. Those are used to move, scale, and rotate subtools in relation to one another. The hotkeys are W, E, and R. So if I go here and I want to scale this, I'll just press E for scale, and then scale them down. Control Z will undo. So the transpose tools are really useful. We also use those for posing our characters, and that's something we're going to talk about in our lesson just on transpose. From here to here, we have brush controls. These three buttons here, mRGB, RGB, and M, control whether or not your brush is applying material and color, or just material. Now what that means is if I'm on the standard brush and I fill my object with a color here, let's just fill it with the color white. We'll talk more about this when we get into painting in a later chapter, but right now I just want to illustrate this point. I'm going to turn off Z-Add, so right now my brush does nothing. If I turn on mRGB and then I select a different material, the other subtools will change color and material based on what I select, but the currently active one will not. My brush will apply color and material. If I select just color, my brush will only paint color. If I select just material, it will only paint material. So that's just a way of controlling what your brush adds. Generally, we have RGB turned on when we're painting. That's the most common use of these objects here. Now we've got Z-Add and Z-Sub. You remember that I said when we're sculpting, by default it's on Z-Add. If you hold down the Alt key, it will subtract. It'll go to Z-Sub. I always just leave Z-Add on. I never turn on Z-Sub. Reason being, if I need to subtract, I'll just hold down the Alt key. The sliders here control the intensity of your brush, the draw size, and your focal shift. Now, we already saw these in the Quick Start section, but these menu items, I find it much easier to access using the space bar here. So I use the spacebar menu to pull up all of these tools that you see at the top of the screen. Now you see we've got active and total points. Active points tells me how many polygons that I've got in the particular active Z tool at the current subdivision level. Total gives me the total points of everything that is currently in ZBrush, or in this Z tool. So those are actually quite useful readouts there. So now we've seen the interface elements that run along the sidebars, the dock, and the top bar. Now we can take a look at these menus themselves. These menus might look really intimidating. You might see there's so many things here. It's not something that I'm accustomed to looking at, maybe in Photoshop or Maya. Don't be discouraged. These menus, there's actually a few of them you're never really going to use, and there's a couple that you're going to constantly be using. So I'm going to give you a general overview of what all these menus are and which ones you're actually going to be using on a regular basis. So beginning at the top of the screen, we have the Alpha menu. And the Alpha menu is the menu that we're going to use to import, export, and manipulate alphas. And alphas we have a whole lecture dedicated to. They're essentially grayscale images that are used in ZBrush to change the shape of your brush, to generate pieces of geometry, and you can also use them as stencils. So everything that you need to do to manipulate your alphas you'll find under this menu. And it's a menu that you'll find yourself using with some regularity. The brush menu is where you go to edit all the parameters for each brush. So you've got your entire brush palette here, and for each brush that you select, you can enter into the brush menu, and then you can edit the specifics of that particular brush. So you can come in here and control the curve or the depth controls, or any of the specialized masking controls for each individual brush are all located here. So the brush menu is a menu that you'll find yourself using, again, with some regularity. But it's not a menu that you're going to be spending as much time in as, say, the tool menu here, which is probably the workhorse menu. It's the backbone of ZBrush. The color menu is where you go to select your colors, as well as fill the object with a color or material, and also access your system palette. The document window controls the document itself. Now you remember how I said that the viewing working area here is actually your document. So this is where you can change things like the resolution of your document. You could also change your settings on your document and then save it. So every time you start ZBrush, it saves with those particular settings. So for example, if I wanted a lighter gray background and a higher resolution document, I could make those changes and then save them by saving a startup document. The Draw menu controls the way tools are drawn on the canvas and the way brushes interact with the tools. So a lot of stuff that you use in here you actually just access from the menus outside of the top menu bars. For example, your Z intensity sliders, Z add, Z sub. The Draw menu also gives you access to the perspective settings, so I can control the angle of view on my perspective. And if I go into the Draw menu, I've also got access to the grids. The grids are a method of bringing photo reference into ZBrush and aligning it with your sculpture while you're working. So we'll be talking about those later on in our lessons, but this is something that's extremely important to be able to do, and the Draw menu is where you access it. For the most part, I don't find that I come to the Draw menu very often. I usually access all the things that I need here on a regular basis just at the top of the screen or in my spacebar menu. The Edit menu is where you're going to find your undos. That is Control Z, and I've been spending so much time in New Zealand. Control Z or Control Z will do your undos. The File menu is where you save your files. Now you can save your projects here. That's the default save. If I press Control S, it's going to default to saving a project. Also under the File menu, you'll see that you can actually save canvases. You can save tools or meshes, which is the same as going to the Tool menu and saving here. You can also save timelines, spotlights, textures, and alphas. So basically anything that you can save out of ZBrush that is a document or a tool, you can do it here in the File menu. For the most part, we just go ahead and use the File Save As. The Layer menu. Now this is one that's often confused with sculpting layers. This is one of those menus which you will not find yourself using very often, if at all. These layers were used as a 2.5D illustration tool. So we don't use these for sculpting. These layers were used when ZBrush was exclusively used for illustration. So basically it's a legacy tool that you're not going to find yourself using at all. The layers you'll find yourself using now are under the Tool menu here. These are the layers that you typically use. The Light menu is where we go to adjust the lights. So you can adjust your key light, you can add secondary lights, turn up their intensity, you can place them behind the object. So this is a menu that I find myself using a lot during rendering, and we'll be talking about this menu more in a later chapter. Now the Macro menu is where you'll go to load and create macros. Macros are basically just a recording of a series of button clicks and executed events inside of ZBrush. So if I wanted to record a series of actions, I can record a macro by clicking New Macro, and then I can save it and then play those back at a later time. So for example, if you wanted to open a brush, change some settings to it, and then save it, you can do that using a macro. You could also create a macro that polishes a mesh and then subdivides 3 times. Basically, it's a way of scripting your ZBrush session without having to know scripting language. It's not something that's used very often, but oftentimes students will say, hey, what is this? What is a macro? So just so you understand what it's used for. I don't find people using them very often anymore, but every once in a while a macro will come up along with a Z-script, or sometimes it'll be a nice way to sort of share a process between multiple artists. The Marker menu is another one of those menus that is a legacy tool. Markers were used earlier on in ZBrush. They're not so useful anymore because we now have subtools. So Marker menu is a place that you're not going to find yourself using often at all. Now the Material menu is extremely useful. This allows you to adjust the parameters of the material that you're working on. For example, if I wanted to adjust the specular, I could turn my specular up or down, and you should see it react. Here we go. I'm going to go to my Material menu, and I'll click this radial button to tear it off to the side. So I can adjust my specular curve here. I can make it more diffuse, make it sharper. So all of your modifiers for your material are located here under the material menu. The movie palette's quite useful if you're trying to get a video or a movie or an animation out of ZBrush. You can create turntables directly in ZBrush with the turntable options. You can also do time lapses and history films. If you look at the lesson that we do on Undo History, you'll see how we can take the entire process of sculpting something from a basic sphere all the way up and then play that back as a video and save it out of ZBrush so you can see your entire sculpting session saved as a video. We also have access to the timeline here. The timeline you can show. That allows us to animate and keyframe specific settings and model positions inside of ZBrush. So this is a very useful tool that we'll talk about in more depth later. The picker menu, it's not very useful on a day-to-day basis. There are times that you'll come into the picker menu to perhaps adjust things for a customized brush, but in general, the picker menu is not something that you find yourself using very often. The Preferences menu is the under the hood of ZBrush. This is where you're going to go to make changes to the interface or the behavior of ZBrush itself. Again, it's not a place that we find ourselves going to often, but it is a useful menu. When we do our customizations of ZBrush, then we will go into the Preferences menu. The Render menu is where we go to access our rendering settings. If we want to adjust the shadows or the ambient occlusion or the subsurface scattering, for example, we can do that in the Rendering menu. We can also specify if we're going to use Keyshot as our external renderer here. The Stencil menu is very specialized. The Stencil menu is where we will control stencils. And again, stencils are created from alphas, and we'll talk more about those later on. But if you create a stencil and you need to move it around and adjust the way it applies to the surface of your model, you will do that under the Stencil menu. It's not something that's very, very common, but it is an extremely useful tool that I want to cover with you in the course of these lectures. The Stroke menu is a more elaborate version of our stroke palette here. The stroke palette and the stroke menu control how your brush applies to the surface, if it applies as a freehand stroke or as a spray or as a rectangle. We can also come in here and control our curve brushes. Some brushes behave along a curve. We can control those curves here, and we can also control our lazy mouse and backtrack settings. So basically, everything under the stroke menu deals with how your brush applies to the surface, how it interacts with the surface. The Texture menu is specifically for importing and exporting textures, as well as importing and exporting spotlights, which are a method of texturing inside of ZBrush. It's also where we find the image plane tools here at the very bottom, and this is how we load texture reference, or it's one of the ways we load texture reference into ZBrush. So the Texture menu is quite useful and very specialized. Of course, we come back to the Tool menu. The Tool menu is the backbone of ZBrush, in my opinion. This is where you spend the lion's share of your time. The Tool menu gives you access to all the parameters that are specific to the tool and the subtools that you're currently working on. It also gives you access to the Tool palette, which shows every tool that's currently loaded in ZBrush. Right now, we've got there's the Polysphere head from our first lesson. There is some goggles from the Super Average Soldier. Here we've got the beast that we're currently working on. That's the active subtool. So you see how every tool that's been loaded into ZBrush is accessible through the tool palette here. The Transform menu, again, this is one of those menus where a lot of the items are usually accessed elsewhere. So you can see that most of the things under the Transform menu you'll recognize from being outside of ZBrush. There is these symmetry options here. This is the hotkey that you're pressing when you press X for X symmetry. There's also posable symmetry, which allows you to use symmetry on a model that is in an asymmetrical pose. So that's very, very useful. This is an extremely important menu. Most of the options here I find myself accessing elsewhere in the interface. The Z plugin menu is where you'll find all the extensions and plugins for ZBrush, things like the Multimap Exporter or the 3D Print Exporter. Subtool Master is an extremely useful Z plugin, which allows you to do operations on multiple subtools. And there's Transpose Master, which is another extremely useful plugin, which is used for posing complicated meshes. So if you've got a mesh with multiple subtools, you can pose it into a dynamic position, and all those subtools will follow. That is something that we will be talking about in a later lesson. And now the ZScript menu. This is really specific to anyone who is ZScripting. Now, we do not talk about ZScripting in this series of lectures, but if you do find yourself exploring ZScripting, you will be using the ZScript menu to do that. It does give you the access that you need. As a general day-to-day ZBrush user, you're probably never going to find yourself using the ZScript menu. Now, along the very, very top bar, you can see that we have, most importantly, the Quick Save button here. If we press the Quick Save button, it will automatically save what we're working on into ZBrush's Quick Save folder. The Quick Save folder is accessible from Lightbox, Quick Save, and here you'll find all your quick saves. So it's a very convenient way to be saving as you work, and if you press the hotkey number 9, it'll save for you there. See-through is actually quite interesting. If you turn this down, you can see through to what's behind ZBrush, literally what is behind the program. Now, I have seen people use this with much success to line up photo reference at their desk and work through like that. So it's quite a neat little interface item that some people use to see photo reference, which is loaded behind the program. You can show and hide the top bar menus with this button. If you ever find your top bar is gone, just press Menus. And then Default ZScript, that will just load the default ZScript if you have changed your ZBrush. Now these will scroll through various user interface colors. These are quite useful if you want to play around with different interfaces. And these will load and through different user interface layouts. These are also quite interesting if you want to experiment with a few different layouts. So that's the ZBrush interface. That completes our generalized view. We're going to go much more in depth to specific menus as we get to them in each chapter. I just wanted to give you the generalized overview. Probably the most important thing I want you to take away is that the majority of what you see down here are the most important elements that have been cloned out of these menus up here. And as you're working, you're focused entirely in the document window. You've got access to your brush parameters here. And then as you need brushes or alphas or materials, you'll work to the left side. And then as you need to change things in your tool panel, you'll come over to the right side. So it's quite a logical flow as you're working through the ZBrush interface. So with that completed, let's go ahead and take a look at the next section.